So basically, this king named Chan Balam lived in 683 CE, and he believed in this thing called blood rituals, where basically they gave blood to the gods because they believed that's what the gods wanted it, so they could be happy. And so he took a knife to his area, and he gave it to the gods because that just made them happy, apparently. And basically, the gods were happy. The gods could bring things to them like good plant growth and like good weather and happiness to everyone because everyone wants happiness. Agriculture in Mesoamerica included people growing things like beans, squashes, gourds, and even peppers, because why not? And they took them to these places called ceremonial centers where they could trade. And there were palaces, temples, and palaces and pyramids there where the elites, the priests, and the artists and craftsmen lived also. And the Olmecs became a thing because they were one of the first civilizations in Mesoamerica, and they were the rubber people because there were so many freaking rubber trees in the Gulf of Mexico where they lived on the coast. And happy times.
Olmec society was authoritarian in nature. Thousands of laborers helped in the construction of ceremonial centers, including the ones in San Lorenzo, Tres Zapotes, and La Venta. Each ceremonial site included great temples, pyramids, tombs, sculptures, and much more. Common subjects built these ceremonial centers, drainage systems, and even gave a part of their harvest for elites. This itself was incredible, but it can be argued that the greatest way in which Olmec commoners honored their elites was by sculpting 10-foot tall heads out of basalt rock. Since they didn't have large animals or wheels, laborers had to drag, push, or row boulders to their destinations. The largest sculptures required over 1,000 laborers. The Olmecs managed to spread their influence to Guatemala, Mexico, and El Salvador. And they traded objects made from jade, and they also used obsidian to make knives and axes. The fall of the Olmecs still remains a mystery, even though it is strongly believed that they deliberately destroyed their ceremonial centers at San Lorenzo and La Venta due to civil conflicts and illegitimacy between their government. By 400 BCE, the Olmec Empire was on a strong downfall. After the fall of the Olmec, population grew, urban centers emerged, and long-distance trade routes helped with communication. After the Olmec, the first to establish villages in Guatemala were the Mayans. They were able to artificially enrich the earth and increase the agriculture productivity of the lands they harvested. From 300 to 900 CE, the Mayans were able to build more than 80 ceremonial centers, all of which included pyramids, palaces, and temples. The Mayans organized themselves into small city kingdoms, the largest of which being Tikal. Most of their leaders were given names like Curl Snout, Smoking Frog, and Stormy Sky.
In the 9th century, the Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan Peninsula wanted to weaken the hostile threats and establish a larger political society for Mayas. The rulers preferred to take over captives and integrate them into their own society. In 800 CE, most Maya populations had begun to desert their cities. Possible causes were invasions by foreigners from Mexico, internal dissension, and civil war. Failure of water control led to diminished harvests and demographic collapse. Ecological problems, the spread of epidemic diseases, and natural catastrophes. The Maya society had a large class of priests who maintained a calendar and shared knowledge of writing, astronomy, and mathematics. Priests who studied astronomy and mathematics understood the movements of planets, and they were able to plot planetary cycles and predict eclipses. They invented the concept of zero and its symbol. With their expanding knowledge, priests could calculate the length of a solar year. The calendar that Maya priests had created was one of the most elaborate of the ancient Americas. The Maya calendar consisted of two kinds: a solar year of 365 days governing the agricultural cycle, and a ritual year of 260 days governing daily affairs by organizing times into 20 months of 13-day apiece. They also created an early system of writing. Maya script consisted of ideographic elements and symbols for syllables. The Popol Vuh was a Maya creation myth who which claimed that gods had created humans out of maize and water, ingredients that became human blood and flesh. Priests also taught that gods kept the world going and maintained this agricultural cycle in exchange for honors and sacrifices.
Bloodletting was one of many Mayan rituals that represented their worship for gods. The self-sacrifice was done by lacerations that promoted bleeding, and Mayans believed that blood will be exchanged for natural changes like rain. Beyond sacrifice, Mayan men played a ball game inherited from the Olmecs where players have to get a solid rubber ball through a ring. A hit to the head could lead to severe concussions and eventual death. This game was played for a variety of reasons, such as competitions or concluding treaties. Another way, for both entertainment and sacrifice, was to pit captives against each other. Losers were tortured and killed immediately after the game. In the northern highlands of Mexico were societies that incorporated the lakes to their lifestyle. One of the earliest cities where this can be seen was Teotihuacan. It was home to almost 200,000 and consisted of temples, palaces, small apartments, markets, and workshops. The authority that ruled Teotihuacan included deities, priests, and scholars. Before the Mayan city declined along with its people, books and paintings were recorded to portray the importance of these authority figures.
So this is the society of Teotihuacan, which adopted a lot of their cultural traditions from the Olmecs, such as their calendar, their ball game, and also graphic symbols. On their own, they believe on different gods, such as the earth god, the rain god, and they also perform ritual sacrifices. And so their downfall was due to not having a large military and focusing more on consumer products for distant consumers. And so they burned and sacked Teotihuacan, and a lot of people after that just fled and basically became a ghost town. During this time period, overall time period, during 12,000 BCE, a lot of people relied on hunting and gathering as a food source, which proved insufficient because of drastic weather changes, climate changes. And so this is when they started to develop agricultural systems, or agricultural technology.
Long before people began to cultivate crops, migrants had reached Australia and New Guinea. They lived by hunting and gathering their food. Over time, migration stopped due to rising seas separating the lands. Eventually, social and economic change began to unfold in New Guinea. Voyagers, also known as the Austronesian people, they came from Southeast Asia. The Austronesian people would trade with indigenous peoples and establish their own communities. The Austronesians possessed a sophisticated maritime technology as well as agriculture expertise.
While one branch of the Austronesian-speaking peoples populated the islands of Polynesia, other branches sailed in different directions on the western Pacific. Yet others sailed through the Indian Basin and became the first human settlers of Madagascar. Malagasy, which is the principal language of modern-day Madagascar, is identified as an Austronesian tongue. The Lapita people were the earliest Austronesian migrants to sail into the Pacific Ocean and establish human settlements in the islands. Wherever they settled, Lapita people placed self-sufficient agricultural villages, introducing of crops they inherited from their Austronesian ancestors. For about 1,000 years, Lapita peoples maintained extensive networks of trade and communications across the ocean. After 500 BCE, Lapita trade network fell into disuse because their settlements had grown large enough that they could supply their own needs and focus on the development of their society. After hierarchical chiefdoms were established, which caused contest for power and tension between subordinates. This led to the spread of people that were seeking fresh opportunities in inhabited or lightly populated islands. The Voyage of Rue. A good man who wanted to become a leader and viewed with concern the increasing population of the island started to build a large canoe in search for an inhabited island. Once sailing, he and his crew faced a strong wind which they survived, and after days they found an island that he divided among his crew and populated.
Considered one of the greatest travelers of all time. He was a Moroccan legal scholar. In 1304, he left Morocco to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. He traveled through Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, and arrived in Mecca in 1326. After Mecca, he traveled to Mesopotamia, Persia, down the Red Sea, and to the African coast. Ibn then discovered that the Sultan of Delhi was offering a reward to foreign legal scholars, so he decided to set off for India. However, due to the fact that he took an unconventional route, it took him 3 years to get there. In India, he served as Qadi for 8 years, and he was even appointed the head of a great mission to China. Sadly, a storm destroyed the ship and all of the supplies. But Ibn didn't let that discourage him. After he traveled to southern India, Ceylon, and the Maldive Islands, he visited the equivalent of 40 modern countries and traveled over 73,000 miles. In the time from 1000 to 1500 CE, communications increased more than ever before. This was largely in part because the Mongols provided the foundation for interactions when they conquered regions and made the roads safer to travel on. This allowed merchants to trade goods, ideas, religions, and diseases such as the bubonic plague. The 3 most important motives were said to be trade, diplomacy, and missionary activity. Increased trade led to the emergence of trade cities. Some of these included modern Beijing, Melka, Cambay, Constantinople, Venice, Timbuktu, and Alexandria. Marco Polo is perhaps one of the most well-known long-distance travelers. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo had traveled to China before. One day, they decided to take 17-year-old Marco. The Khan took a special liking to him because of his talent for storytelling. Polo was sent on diplomatic journeys and returned to tell the Khan stories about different regions. After 17 years, Polo left China, and he was eventually captured as a prisoner of war in a dispute between Venice and Genoa. Thanks to the fact that one of the other prisoners was a writer, we now have the stories of Marco Polo's incredible travels.
Okay, so the Mongols and Christians from Western Europe paired up against the Muslim foes to take over Jerusalem, and for the Mongols to take over the Abbasid Empire. After this, the Mongols invited Christians to submit to their rule or be destroyed, but they declined. And in 1287, Mongol Khan wanted to take over Southwest Asia, Jerusalem, and crush Islam, but needed help from France and England. So he sent Raban to go convince them to support them, but later failed. So
Roman Catholic missionaries traveled long distances in the interest of spreading Christianity. A goal that missionaries had was to convert the Mongols and the Chinese to Roman Catholic Christianity. John of Monte Corvino was a Catholic missionary in China. While in China, John worked to establish Christianity into society. He translated religious works into Turkish. He built churches and taught Roman Catholic rituals. Long-distance travel encouraged cultural exchanges between different societies. They exchanged stories, religious ideas, scientific knowledge, etc. The magnetic compass allowed long-distance journeys, and Muslim travelers were able to introduce new crops to Africa.
Diffusion of gunpowder technology. Muslim merchants and travelers, Mongols also contributed to the process, notably helping it spread west from China. Mongol invaders learned about gunpowder from Chinese military engineers in the 13th centuries and incorporated gunpowder-based weapons in their arsenal. They campaigned to Persia and Southwest Asia. Muslim armies followed their footsteps soon after. Mid-13th century, gunpowder reached Europe and led to the experiment with gunpowder-fueled rockets. Gunpowder technology spread rapidly with the development of cannons. The Little Ice Age was when temperatures were cooler than in the era 1000 to 13,000 CE. Due to cooler temperatures, seasons grew shorter, agricultural production declined, leading to famine. The bubonic plague spread from the Yunnan region of southwestern China. The plague infected rodents, and fleas transmitted the pathogen from one rodent to another. The epidemic in 1331 reportedly killed 90% of the population in Hebei province in northeastern China. During the 1350s, epidemics broke out in widely scattered regions of China. In the 1340s, Mongols, merchants, and other travelers helped spread the disease along trade routes to points in West China, thrived in oases and trading cities in Central Asia. By 1346, it had reached the Black Sea ports of Kaffa and Tana. In 1347, Italian merchants fled plague-infected Black Sea profs, which spread the disease through the Mediterranean basin. Plague had started epidemics in most of Western Europe.
After the collapse of the Yuan dynasty ruled by Mongols, a new emperor named Hongwu proclaimed the establishment of the Ming dynasty, which lasted until 1644. Hongwu immediately started eliminating traces of Mongol rule. The Ming dynasty was ruled without the aid of chief ministers, and they closely supervised imperial affairs. The absolute obedience to the policies of the central government was forced, and Ming emperors turned to eunuchs for governmental services, and it enhanced the authority of the central government. The Ming emperors worked toward economic recovery from nomadic rule and epidemic disease. They coerced laborers to rebuild irrigation system, promoted manufacture and Chinese cultural traditions like Confucian and Neo-Confucian schools. In Europe, political authority rested with a series of regional states. Internal problems as well as bubonic plague complicated European political affairs. By the late 15th century, regional states in Western Europe had greatly strengthened their societies. The state-building efforts of the later Middle Ages involved the development of fresh sources of finance and the maintenance of large armies. Competition between European states increased as they compressed their authority in their territories that led to small-scale wars between the states conducing technological innovations.
So during the recovery of Western Europe, the Renaissance became a thing, and basically Renaissance means rebirth. And it makes sense being that so much chaos recently just happened, so they really need a rebirth. And during this time period, they really appreciated art and the human body because why not? The Renaissance got a lot of popularity, especially within Italy, where they promoted it so much that sculptors and painters got really into it, including painters like Marsilio and Leonardo da Vinci to start painting people on two-dimensional surface, along with sculptors like Donatello and Michelangelo to sculpt realistic poses of humans in stone. Another cool thing about the Renaissance is that architecture got very complex and really cool back in that time, including the domes. The domes became extremely impressive, being how complex they were to create in the first place. And humans nowadays are still in denial that humans back then were able to do such a thing, so it makes it quite cool and impressive. And then all of a sudden, the humanists became a thing, and basically humanists were people that are very dedicated to Christianity. So dedicated that they die for a man that is already dead. So Jesus, yeah. And basically they dedicated their lives to basically like translate the New Testament to the point where they could spread it all across Europe so they can find reformers. They were like low-key missionaries, just that they were called humanists instead of missionaries.
After the 14th century, the societies of Europe and Asia sought ways to revive long-distance trade. In China, trade with foreigners were permitted in closely supervised trading ports. Sea lanes were connected by a series of expeditions by Yongle, led by Zhang He, to impose control on trade and impress foreigners. In 30 years, Zhang He journeyed the oceans of Asia and Africa. He established Chinese authority by showing military power and paying respects to local and their deities. In the mid-1430s, these voyages were stopped in favor of using finance for agriculture and defense against the military threat of Mongols. Only ports in Asia stayed open for trade. Unlike the Chinese, Europeans ventured into the seas to spread Roman Catholic Christianity and commercial opportunities. For example, Prince Harry of Portugal embarked on a journey that enabled Christians to move through the Atlantic and Mediterranean. In the Cape Verde Islands, fertile soil was used to domesticate sugarcane for Italian investors. The Portuguese enhanced slave trade by transporting African slaves in bulks from Africa to the Atlantic to become domestic servants. Some mariners sought to find a route that directly linked to Asia. Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope around the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama was taught by a Muslim pilot to use seasonal monsoons to sail to India. In the following century, Portuguese mariners dominated trade between Europe and Asia. Genoese Christopher Columbus intended to sail to Asia by heading west. The Catholic kings funded his expedition after others believed that the long distance would not be worth it. He returned without goods, but insisted that he stumbled upon Asian states. Only by the end of the 15th century did other mariners realize that there is a world beyond Asia, Africa, and Europe.
1497, Vasco da Gama took 4 merchant vessels to India in hopes of trading for pepper and spices. More than 10 months later, on May 20th, 1498, they arrived in Calicut in South India. Aside from spices, the Calicut markets offered rubies, emeralds, fine textiles, and gold jewelry. Gama traded gold for pepper, cinnamon, and other goods. In 1500 CE, Europeans crossed oceans in higher concentrations. Ming emperors also sponsored maritime expeditions. However, by 1435, there was no more state-sponsored expeditions. European influence led to the establishment of a global economy, which led to a growth in overall population, despite the deaths caused by diseases such as the bubonic plague. Private investors provided the necessary capital for these expeditions. These expeditions helped to chart the oceans and develop an understanding of world geography. The most popular motive was the search for basic resources and land that could be used for cash crops. Due to poverty in the kingdom, the Portuguese were some of the most dedicated sailors. Beginning in the 13th century, seamen began venturing further and further away from coasts. Europeans had a high demand for sugar. This made the temptation of building sugar plantations in islands too great. Italians started to build sugar plantations in Palestine and the Mediterranean islands. They helped Portuguese mariners, and eventually the Portuguese were able to establish sugar plantations on the Cape Verde Islands, São Tomé, Príncipe, and Fernando Po. European demand for Asian goods was even higher than their demand for fresh farmland. Due to the fall of the Mongol Empire and the bubonic plague, trade routes were no longer safe to travel on, but Muslim merchants were still able to bring in Asian goods to Cairo. However, the prices were super high, too high to meet the growing demand of the Europeans. Aside from land for cash crops and Asian goods, Europeans also wanted to spread Christian influence. Sometimes this took peaceful forms. Missionaries traveled to Central Asia, India, and China to search for converts. However, the need for Christian expansion wasn't always peaceful. Europeans launched the Crusades against Muslims in Palestine, the Mediterranean, and Iberia. The motives for expansion and exploration can be justified with Vasco da Gama's words, Christians and spices.
European voyages would not have taken place without new navigational equipment. Sturdy ships included square and triangular sails to utilize winds and move across water efficiently. Compasses originating from the Tang or Song dynasty helped Europeans navigate. Astrolabes determined latitude. Both instruments helped mariners to collect data on Earth's geography. Technology also helped Europeans learn about the movement of currents and winds that became advantageous in sailing to any part of the Earth. For example, they understood summer monsoon winds blow from the southeast in the Indian Ocean and in winter from the northwest. A strategy called volta do mar built onto the principle that sailing around contrary winds instead of against them was more efficient. This enabled mariners to travel around coastlines throughout the world. This led to the 13th century's many European expeditions. The Vivaldi brothers encouraged the idea of exploring the Atlantic and finding a trade route from the Mediterranean to India. Europeans sailed frequently and rediscovered much of the Canary Islands. Prince Henry of Portugal conquered the Moroccan part of Ceuta and sponsored voyages down the African coast. Bartholomew Diaz established trade routes around the Cape of Good Hope. Vasco da Gama went on a rough voyage that ended with a profitable return to Portugal with cargoes of pepper and cinnamon. By the late 16th century, Europeans successfully established more trading ports in the Indian Ocean basin.
Cristoforo Colombo, known in English as Christopher Columbus 1451 to 1506, proposed sailing to the markets of Asia by a western route. The Portuguese court declined his proposal for his royal sponsorship. Eventually, Fernando and Isabel of Spain agreed to underwrite Columbus's expedition. In August 1492, his fleet of 3 ships departed Palos of southern Spain, and on the morning of October 12, 1492, he made landfall in the Bahamas. Columbus Columbus's voyages to the Western Hemisphere had momentous consequences since they established links between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres and paved the way for the conquest, settlement, and exploitation of the Americans by European peoples. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, a Spanish military commander, sighted the Pacific Ocean in 1513 while searching for gold. Ferdinand Magellan, on his Pacific expedition and circumnavigation, sailed in the service of Spain. In the search of an elusive northwest passage from Europe to Asia, English mariners established many details of Pacific geography. Sir Francis Drake scouted the west coast of North America as far north as Vancouver Island. By the 18th century, Russians were also exploring the Pacific Ocean, who commissioned Vitus Bering to undertake 2 maritime expeditions in search of northeast passage to Asian ports. Captain James Cook was the most important Pacific explorer. He led 3 expeditions to the Pacific and died in a scuffle with the indigenous people of Hawaii. He charted an Eastern Australia and New Zealand, and he added New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and Hawaii to European maps. European geographers had a reasonably accurate understanding of the world's ocean basins, their lands, and their peoples.
Alright, so Portuguese mariners built trading posts over the ocean in hopes of taking control over the ocean. And for example, Vasco da Gama in 1498 built a trading post with permission of the Calicut to build a trading post, and so by the mid-16th century, they had over 50 trading posts between Africa and Asia. And so the commander, Alfonso de Albuquerque, had a policy where if mariners didn't have a safe contact pass, they'd be executed. Many times, their hands would get cut off and stuff like that. And so it wasn't safe to travel without the safe contact pass. And even though many people knew that, they took a risk of traveling without it, so they didn't have to pay extra fees. And by the 15th century, English and Dutch took over the seas because the Portuguese population had gone down and they lost power.
So Europe decided to go crazy and greedy and wanted to take over land. So they went all the way to this place called Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, so they could build territorial empires and colonies. But the Asians, where they were like, oh hell no, this is our land. And so they decided to fight back and prevented Europeans from taking over everything. So Europeans were upset about that. But the Europeans did not give up, and they went after this place called the Philippines, where it took over lands, for example, like Manila and places like Cebu. And because since the Philippines didn't have a strong central government, it wasn't hard for the Spanish forces to take over everything, and the Philippines couldn't really do anything. So now that the Philippines were under Spanish rule, the Spanish took interest in this place called Manila, where basically they transformed the city of the Philippines into a multicultural port city. And basically a port city was where ships and traders and merchants could trade their goods and basically trade their goods, and they could spread their Christianity specifically, which they found a very huge interest, being that so many people went there because, you know them, they loved Jesus, so yeah, Jesus.
Commercial rivalries combined with political differences came to the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War took place in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and North America. It involved Asian American peoples as well as Europeans. European explorers established links between all lands. They interacted with people and exchanged plants, food crops, and animals. It also brought disease pathogens and started epidemics, such as smallpox. The Columbian Exchange caused a surge in population and also helped the spread of human populations through oceanic migration. The Columbian Exchange enriched European diets by introducing new food crops.
Trading post empires established by Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants linked Asian markets with European consumers and offered opportunities for European mariners to join the carrying trade within Asia. By the 16th century, European merchants were prominent in the trading world of the Indian Ocean basin. The Europeans encouraged commerce in the Eastern Hemisphere and also encouraged the development of a global trading system. Hunters sought to sell animal fur because it was a prominent good on the world market. The hunting of animal fur soon drove many species into extinction or near extinction, altering their environments. Later on, the size of global trade increased as merchants around the world contributed to the development of the global market, and by 1759, all parts of the world participated in global networks of commercial relations in which European merchants played the main role. The starting of new diseases into the Americas and Oceania caused massive population losses. The only cure for these diseases was prevention because once infected, there was no cure. This fact inspired pre-modern physicians to experiment for a way to resist it or avoid it. The experiments of the English physician Edward Jenner created a powerful vaccine against smallpox. Yet many people saw it as an unnatural practice and denied the vaccine.
So there once lived this man named Martin Luther, and basically he fell into conflict with the Roman Catholic Church because he discovered that they were selling these things to people called indulgences, where if they bought them, that they were supposedly given a ticket to heaven and all their sins would be forgiven, which was a total lie so that the Roman Catholic Church could just make money because of economy. So he thought these were signs of specifically like greed, hypocrisy, and moral rot within specifically the Roman Catholic Church. So he created this thing called the 95 Thesis, which spread all throughout Europe, exposing how wrong the Roman Catholic Church was, and it spread pretty quickly and all chaos ran loose. This later led to the time of the Protestant Reformation, which basically included how Martin Luther, fell into conflict with the Roman Catholic Church and that he bashed them so much that he created the Lutheran Christianity, which basically was surrounded by his thoughts of how Christianity should be, which sparked Protestant movements, which spread the Christianity all over Europe.
Roman Catholic authorities undertook massive reform efforts in their church to define points of doctrine to clarify the differences between Roman and Protestant churches and Reformation. The Council of Trent was important in defining the Catholic Reformation. It was an assembly of bishops, cardinals, and other high church officials who met intermittently between 1545 and 1563 to address matters of reform and doctrine. St. Ignatius Loyola was a Basque nobleman and soldier who also founded the Society of Jesus. This institution took the offensive and sought to extend the boundaries of the Reformed Roman Church. Members of the society had to complete rigorous and advanced education. They were known as Jesuits. They made effective missionaries. The hunt for witches was the most destructive in Europe apart from the wars. Witchcraft became a convenient explanation for unpleasant turn of events, failure of a crop, outbreak of a fire, and an unexpected death or inability to conceive a child. The most intense witch hunt took place in New England in the 17th century, where a population of 100,000 colonists tried 234 individuals for witchcraft and executed 36 of them. The last legal witch execution took place in 1782. Religious wars wrecked France for 36 years, 1562 to 1598. The 30 Years' War was a massive continental conflict, 1618 to 1648. It was the most destructive European war before the 20th century. Emperor Charles V established the Holy Roman Empire as a preeminent political authority in Europe in the 16th century, but by mid-century it was clear there would be no revival of the empire. When Charles V became emperor in 1519, he acquired authority over Germany, Bohemia, with Switzerland, and parts of northern Italy. Charles had devoted much of his attention and energy to the Lutheran movement and to imperial princes who took advantage of religious controversy to assert their independence. He did not have ambition to extend his authority. Foreign difficulties also prevented Charles from establishing his empire.
The rulers that emerged during the lack of central powers were known as the new monarchs, and they were able to build strong regimes. These monarchs included Henry VIII of England, Louis XI and Francis I of France, and Fernando and Isabella of Spain. The new monarchs wanted to find new sources of finance, so the French levied taxes, the Spanish boosted sales tax, but the English didn't introduce any new taxes out of fear of rebellion. With this newfound revenue, the French and Spanish monarchs were able to maintain standing armies that were too large for nobility to defeat. English monarchs didn't need standing armies to put down occasional rebellions, but they were still able to put noble power beneath them. Fernando and Isabella founded the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. The Spanish Inquisition justified the prosecution of those who were Jewish, Muslim, or Protestant. People who were suspected of religious heresy were forced to undergo ruthless torture. Before the 17th century, neither the English or the Dutch had a constitutional government. Eventually, the English were able to establish a constitutional monarchy, while in the Netherlands they established a republic based off a representational government. Due to political and religious disputes, the English constitutional monarchy came crashing down, and from 1642 to 1649 there was the English Civil War. Kings supported the Anglican Church, but the Puritans wanted to cleanse the church of bishop hierarchy and elaborate ceremonies. Both sides raised armies, and the war didn't end until King Charles was captured in 1641 and beheaded. Without a king, the Puritans turned the monarchy into a dictatorship. Parliament later invited King James II, his daughter Mary, and her husband William of Orange to help rule the Parliament. In 1566, King Philip II of Spain wanted to suppress the Calvinist movement in the Netherlands. In 1581, a Dutch anti-Spanish alliance proclaimed themselves as independent provinces, which the Spanish didn't accept until after the 30 Years' War.